He moved into the neighborhood on a quiet weekday morning, the kind of morning where nothing feels rushed. The street looked calm, almost too calm. Every lawn was trimmed the same way, every fence painted the same color, and every house followed a pattern that felt planned years ago. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted peace, order, and no surprises. At first, that was exactly what he liked about it. He wasn't loud. He wasn't social in a forced way. He worked long hours, kept his routine simple, and valued privacy more than anything. He believed that if you respected others, they would respect you back. That belief had worked for him in most places he had lived before. He assumed it would work here too. The first week passed quietly. He unpacked slowly, fixed a few small things around the house, and mostly stayed indoors. When he did step outside, neighbors watched from a distance. Some smiled politely. Others didn't. He noticed it, but didn't think much of it. Every neighborhood has people who like to observe newcomers. On the third day, a letter appeared on his door. It wasn't mailed. It was placed carefully, like someone wanted to make sure he saw it right away. The paper was thick, official-looking, and printed in bold text. It mentioned a violation. According to the letter, his trash bin had been visible from the street for longer than allowed. He read it twice. Confused, the trash had been taken out late the night before, and he brought the bin back in early the next morning. It hadn't even been out for 12 hours. Still, the letter said the rule was clear and warned that future violations could lead to fines. He shrugged it off. Mistakes happen. The next day, another letter showed up. This time, it mentioned his front yard. Apparently, the grass length was not within approved limits. He looked at his lawn, then at his, the neighbors. They looked the same. That was when he first felt something was off. He decided to attend the HOA, meeting listed at the bottom of the letter. He believed face-to-face conversations solved most problems. Emails could be misunderstood. Letters had no tone. Talking calmly usually cleared things up. The meeting was held in a small community building near the entrance of the neighborhood. The room was filled with folding chairs, a long table at the front, and a large printed sign showing the HOA logo. A few residents were already seated when he arrived. Most of them avoided eye contact. At the front sat the HOA president. She had a confident posture and a voice that carried across the room even when she spoke normally. She controlled the meeting from the moment it began, setting rules, cutting people off, and deciding who was allowed to speak and for how long. When it was his turn, he stood and calmly explained the situation. He said he had received 2 violation notices and wanted clarification. He kept his tone respectful. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. She looked at him like he was wasting her time. She told him the rules were clear and that the HOA had full authority to enforce them. When he tried to explain that the violations seemed incorrect, she interrupted him. She said ignorance of the rules wasn't an excuse. He sat down, feeling dismissed. After the meeting, he tried to approach her privately. He asked if there was a way to resolve things without constant letters. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind that felt practiced. She told him very clearly that the HOA did not negotiate. From that day on, the letters increased. They came every few days. Sometimes they were about parking. Sometimes about noise, even though he rarely had visitors. One letter even mentioned suspicious behavior, without explaining what that meant. He started documenting everything. He took photos of his yard, his trash bins, his driveway. He kept copies of every letter. He believed that if things ever went too far, facts would protect him. What he didn't know was that things had already gone too far. Neighbors began acting differently. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Some people looked at him with concern. Others looked at him like he didn't belong there. He later learned that the HOA president had been talking about him during meetings, framing him as a problem resident who refused to follow rules. One afternoon, a neighbor quietly warned him. The neighbor spoke in a low voice, almost afraid to be heard. He said the HOA president had a history of handling things her own way. He didn't explain much more, only advising him to be careful. That night, another letter appeared. This one was different. It said that if he continued to ignore HOA authority, further action would be taken. It didn't say what kind of action. It didn't need to. The message was clear enough he considered moving, but something about the situation bothered him deeply. He hadn't broken any rules. He had done nothing wrong. Leaving would mean accepting blame for something he didn't do. And he wasn't someone who backed down just because someone else enjoyed power. He decided to stay calm and continue following the rules exactly as written. For a few days, nothing happened. Then one evening, as the sun was starting to set, a car parked across from his house. He didn't recognize it. Two people sat inside, watching his home. They didn't get out. They didn't speak to anyone. They just watched. The next day, the HOA president knocked on his door. She didn't ask to come in. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, speaking loudly enough for neighbors to hear. She told him there had been complaints. She said his behavior was making people uncomfortable. When he asked what behavior she meant, she didn't answer. Instead, she warned him. She said the HOA had ways of enforcing compliance beyond letters and fines. She said she had connections. She said it would be easier for everyone if he simply followed orders. He replied calmly. He said he would continue following the rules and that any further communication should be in writing. Her expression changed. She told him he was being difficult. That night, he couldn't sleep. He replayed the conversation over and over in his head. He felt something building, something heavy and wrong. He trusted his instincts. They had never failed him before. The next morning, he noticed something taped to his mailbox. It was another notice, but this one looked different. It used stronger language. It mentioned enforcement action. It said failure to comply could result in removal. Removal of what? It didn't say. He contacted a legal office for advice. They told him HOAs had limited authority and could not detain or arrest anyone. That gave him some relief, but also raised a troubling question. If they couldn't do that, why did the letter sound like they would? The answer came sooner than expected, 2 days later. Just after dinner, someone knocked on his door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was firm, heavy, and repeated. When he looked through the window, he saw two unfamiliar people standing outside. They wore dark clothing and badges that looked official at first glance. One of them spoke loudly, announcing they were there regarding an HOA enforcement matter. His heart slowed. Instead of racing, something wasn't right. He opened the door just enough to speak. He asked for identification. They showed badges quickly, too quickly. They told him he was required to comply and step outside. Across the street, the HOA president stood watching. She didn't hide it. She stood with her arms folded, a confident look on her face like she had finally won. He took a deep breath. He didn't argue. He didn't panic. He simply asked one question that would change everything. Under what authority they hesitated. Just for a moment, and in that moment, he knew the truth. This wasn't enforcement. This was a setup. And while everyone around believed he was about to be arrested, he calmly reached for his phone, knowing that what was about to happen next would shock everyone watching. He didn't step outside right away. He stood in the doorway, one hand still on the doorframe, the other holding his phone loosely at his side. The two people on the porch looked impatient. One of them shifted his weight as if trying to appear authoritative, while the other kept glancing toward the street. Where a few neighbors had started to gather, the HOA president remained across the road, watching closely. She didn't say a word, but her presence alone felt loud. It was clear she wanted an audience. He asked again, calmly, under what authority they were there. This time, one of them answered more firmly. He said they were acting on behalf of the Homeowners Association and that there had been repeated violations. He claimed they had the right to escort him for further questioning. The wording felt carefully chosen. Escort, questioning, not arrest, not detention. He nodded slowly as if considering their words. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse them of anything. Instead, he asked if he could record the interaction. The mood shifted. One of them said recording wasn't allowed. The other said it didn't matter. They disagreed quietly for a few seconds. then turned back to him with forced confidence. That hesitation told him everything. Neighbors were now openly watching. Some stood on their porches. Others pretended to water plants while clearly listening. Phones came out. Whispers spread. The HOA president finally stepped forward. She said loudly that this was the result of continued noncompliance and that she hoped this would teach others a lesson. She spoke like someone delivering a final verdict, not like someone involved in a misunderstanding. He looked at her. Then back at the two people on his porch. He said he would cooperate, but only after making a phone call. They tried to refuse. They said it wasn't necessary. He reminded them calmly that he was still on his own property and had not been given any legal order. He said the call would only take a moment. Reluctantly, they agreed. He stepped back inside, closing the door, but not locking it. His hands were steady as he scrolled through his phone. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call a friend. He called a number he knew by heart. When the call connected, he spoke quietly and clearly. He explained the situation in simple terms. He gave the address. He described the people outside. He said he believed they were impersonating authority under HOA direction. The response on the other end was calm. He was told to stay where he was. Remain cooperative and keep the line open if possible. He hung up and returned to the door. Outside, the situation had grown more tense. The two people on the porch were whispering to each other again. One of them checked his phone repeatedly. The HOA president looked annoyed now, pacing slightly. She demanded to know who he had called. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked them to provide written documentation of their authority. He asked for names, badge numbers, official identification. Questions irritated them. They repeated that this wasn't necessary and that things would go easier if he stopped resisting another. Carefully chosen word, he reminded them, calmly, that asking questions was not resistance. That was when one of them stepped closer. Not aggressively, but enough to cross a boundary. Enough to make it look serious. Enough for neighbors to gasp quietly. The HOA president smiled. He raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, but in a peaceful gesture. He said he didn't want any trouble. He said he just wanted clarity. That only made things worse. The one who had stepped forward told him to turn around. He said it would be better if he didn't make this harder than it needed to be. For the first time, fear moved through the crowd. Not fear of him, but fear of what was happening. This didn't look right. It didn't sound right. Even people who had believed the HOA president before were starting to feel uncomfortable. He looked past them and saw a neighbor shaking their head slowly. Another neighbor whispered into a phone, likely calling someone. The HOA president noticed the shift in energy. She raised her voice, telling everyone to go back inside, saying this was an HOA matter and not to interfere. But her authority didn't feel as strong anymore. The situation had slipped beyond her control. The two people on the porch tried to hurry things along. They said they needed him to step outside now. He said he would. But only after one more thing. He asked them directly if they were law enforcement. They avoided the question. They said they were authorized personnel. That answer sealed it. He stepped outside slowly, keeping his movements calm and visible. He stood on the porch, not the driveway, making it clear he was still on his property. He kept his voice even, respectful. He said he would not resist, but he would not consent to anything unlawful. Those words made them nervous. One of them said they didn't have time for this and reached toward his arm, not grabbing, but close enough to threaten it at that exact moment. A sound cut through the tension. Sirens distant at first, but unmistakable. The HOA president froze. The two people on the porch stiffened. Neighbors leaned forward, some stepping closer without realizing it. The sirens grew louder. One of the people outside cursed under his breath. He took a step back, suddenly less confident. The other tried to act calm, but his eyes darted toward the street. The HOA president's face changed completely. She looked confused, then worried, then angry. She demanded to know who had called the police. No one answered her. The sirens stopped just down the street. Doors opened. Footsteps approached. Real officers walked into view, Everything changed in seconds. The posture of the two people on the porch shifted instantly. Their shoulders lowered. Their voices softened. The authority they had been projecting vanished. The officers approached calmly, assessing the scene without rushing. They asked what was going on. The HOA president spoke first. She tried to explain, talking quickly, framing the situation as a non-compliant resident causing trouble. She said she had called in help to enforce HOA rules. The officers listened quietly. Then they turned to him. He explained everything, slowly and clearly. He described the letters, the threats, the fake enforcement notices, and the people who had shown up claiming authority. He told them he believed this was an attempt to intimidate him. The officers asked for identification. Everyone provided theirs. When they examined the badges of the two people, their expressions changed. The badges were not official. They were cheap replicas. The officers asked them who they worked for. Their answers didn't match. One said private security. The other said HOA enforcement. Neither could provide valid credentials. The neighbors watched in silence. The HOA president started backing away, physically and verbally. She said she didn't know the details. She said she was only trying to maintain order. The officers asked her who authorized this action. She hesitated. That hesitation spoke louder than words. The officers separated everyone and began asking questions individually. Statements were taken. Phones were checked. Records were requested. The two people were no longer in control of anything. The HOA president tried to regain authority, but it was gone. She was just another person standing on the sidewalk now, surrounded by consequences she hadn't anticipated. As the questioning continued, neighbors began talking among themselves. Shock spread through the crowd. People who had trusted the HOA felt betrayed. People who had stayed silent felt regret. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about power being abused, the officers informed. Everyone that impersonating authority and attempting unlawful detention were serious matters. They made it clear that HOAs had no power to do what had just happened. The HOA president looked like she might argue, but she didn't. She couldn't. The night ended quietly, but nothing would ever feel the same again. As the officers left, one of them spoke privately with him. They thanked him for staying calm. They said he had done the right thing. He nodded, exhausted but steady. Across the street, the HOA president stood alone. No confidence, no smile, no audience, only the realization that what she had started was far from over. And as neighbors returned to their homes, one truth settled heavily over the street. This was no longer just an HOA dispute. This was the beginning of consequences that would shock everyone. The neighborhood felt different the next morning. The street was quiet but not peaceful. Curtains moved slightly as people looked outside. Doors opened and closed more often than usual. Everyone knew what had happened the night before, even if they hadn't witnessed it themselves. He woke up early, earlier than normal. Sleep hadn't come easily. His mind kept replaying the moment the sirens appeared, the way confidence had drained from certain faces, and the shock in the crowd. It was over for the night, but he knew it wasn't really over, not even close. By mid-morning, his phone started ringing. Some calls were from neighbors he barely knew. Others were from people who had avoided him before. They asked if he was okay. Some apologized quietly for believing the rumors. A few admitted they had been afraid to speak up because they had seen what happened to people who challenged the HOA. He listened more than he spoke. One neighbor told him something important. The HOA president had been holding emergency conversations late into the night, calling board members and trying to control the story. She was telling people that everything had been a misunderstanding and that she had never intended for things to go that far. That explanation didn't sit well with anyone who had been there. The next HOA meeting was scheduled sooner than usual. Word spread quickly. People planned to attend who had never shown up before. The room that was usually half empty was suddenly packed. He arrived early, sat near the back. The HOA president arrived later than usual. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't smile. Her posture, once confident and commanding, looked stiff. She avoided eye contact as she took her seat. The meeting began awkwardly. She tried to move quickly through routine topics, but hands went up almost immediately. People asked questions she wasn't prepared for. They asked why unauthorized individuals were sent to a resident's home. They asked who approved it. They asked if HOA funds were used. Her answers were vague. She said the situation had escalated unexpectedly. She said she had relied on advice from others. She said her intentions were misunderstood. The room didn't accept that. One resident stood up and asked a simple question. Did the HOA have the legal right to do what was done? There was no clear answer. Another resident asked if this could happen to anyone else. That question changed the mood completely. Fear replaced frustration. People realized this wasn't just about one person. It was about power being used without limits. It was about what could happen if no one pushed back. He remained silent, watching everything unfold. Then someone asked him to speak. He didn't want to at first. He didn't enjoy attention. But he stood anyway. He spoke calmly, not emotionally. He explained what he had experienced, step by step. He showed copies of letters. He described the threats. He described the moment when people showed up claiming authority they didn't have. He didn't attack anyone personally. He just shared facts. The room was silent. When he finished, the HOA president tried to respond, but her words sounded weak. She promised to review procedures. She said things would change, but the damage was done. After the meeting, several residents approached him privately. Some shared their own stories of intimidation, unfair fines, and fear of retaliation. They had stayed quiet because they didn't think anyone would listen. Now they felt brave enough to talk. That same afternoon, he received a call from a legal representative. Someone had filed a formal complaint about the incident. An investigation had been opened. Statements would be required. He agreed to cooperate fully. Over the next few days, more information came out. The two individuals who had shown up at his door were not connected to any legitimate authority. They had been hired privately. Their badges were not only fake, but poorly made. Records showed no legal basis for their actions. The HOA president denied knowing the full details. But evidence suggested otherwise. Messages, emails, payment records. Everything pointed back to her decisions. Neighbors began distancing themselves from her. The same people who once defended her authority now avoided her completely. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Trust vanished quickly. He didn't celebrate. He focused on staying steady. The investigation continued quietly. Officials visited the neighborhood. They spoke to residents. They reviewed HOA records. The atmosphere became tense again, but this time for a different reason. People were afraid of what they might uncover. One evening, as he sat on his porch, a neighbor joined him. They talked about how power had slowly changed the HOA president over the years. How she started with good intentions, but became obsessed with control. How no one stopped her early enough. He listened, thinking about how easily things could have gone differently if fear hadn't kept people silent. A few days later, official notices were sent out. The HOA president was temporarily suspended pending further review. An interim board was appointed. The announcement shook the neighborhood. Some people felt relieved. Others felt embarrassed for supporting her. A few tried to defend her, saying she only went too far because she cared too much about order, but caring too much never justified crossing the law. The suspended president didn't leave quietly. She began blaming others. She claimed she had been misled. She said she was being targeted unfairly. She told anyone who would listen that she was the real victim. But the truth had already taken root. One afternoon, he received another call. This time, he was asked to come in and give a detailed statement. He went without hesitation. He told everything exactly as it happened. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't hide anything. When he finished, the officer nodded slowly. He was told that what happened wasn't just an HOA issue. It involved serious misuse of authority and deception. The case was moving forward. Walking back to his car, he felt something unexpected. Relief, not because someone else was in trouble, but because the truth was finally visible. Back in the neighborhood, things slowly began to shift. People greeted each other again. Conversations felt lighter. The fear that had quietly controlled the community began to fade. He noticed something else, too. People started questioning rules that never made sense before. They asked why fines were so high. They asked where money was going. They asked why complaints were handled in secret. The community was waking up. One evening, he passed the HOA president's house. The lights were off. The place looked empty, quiet, stripped of the authority it once represented. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt understanding, power. When unchecked, always reveals itself eventually. And as the investigation moved closer to its conclusion, one thing became clear to everyone involved: what had started as an attempt to control one resident had exposed an entire system, and the final outcome would shock far more people than just those on that street. The investigation didn't stay quiet for long. At first, officials moved carefully, asking questions without drawing attention. But as more information surfaced, their presence in the neighborhood became more noticeable. Cars stopped by during the day. Clipboards appeared. Conversations happened on sidewalks and driveways. People realized this was serious. The HOA president tried to keep control from the shadows. Even while suspended, she continued calling board members, sending messages, and trying to influence what people said. Some ignored her. Others were confused and afraid. But the more she pushed, the worse it looked. One afternoon, official letters were delivered to multiple homes. Not warnings, not fines. Formal notices asking for cooperation in an ongoing inquiry. The language was clear and firm. That changed everything. People who had stayed silent for years finally spoke. They shared stories of pressure, threats of fines, and fear of retaliation. Small things that once felt normal now looked disturbing when placed together. A pattern was forming. He was called in again. It's time for a longer session. The room was quiet, professional, and calm. He answered every question honestly. He explained how the situation escalated and how he felt targeted from the beginning. The officials listened closely. They already knew most of it. What surprised him was how much evidence they had collected from others. Messages showing intent. Records showing misuse of HOA funds. Notes proving the fake enforcement wasn't a last-minute decision, but something planned. That revelation hit hard. This hadn't been a mistake. It had been deliberate, back in the neighborhood. The mood shifted again. This time it wasn't fear. It was disbelief. People struggled to accept that someone they trusted had gone that far. Some felt angry. Others felt ashamed for enabling it by staying quiet. A special community meeting was announced. Attendance was mandatory. The building filled beyond capacity. People stood along walls and outside near open doors. The interim board sat at the front, visibly nervous. Officials were present, sitting silently, observing. The former HOA president arrived late. She didn't look confident anymore. Her steps were slow, her expression tense. The room went silent when she entered. The meeting began with a clear statement. The investigation had uncovered serious violations, abuse of authority, financial misconduct, unauthorized actions. Gasps spread through the room. She tried to interrupt, but she was stopped. For the first time, she had no control over the conversation. The details were read out carefully. Hiring unauthorized individuals, using HOA influence to intimidate a resident, creating false documentation, misrepresenting authority. Each point landed heavily. When she was finally allowed to speak, her words came out rushed. She blamed stress. She blamed pressure. She blamed others for not stopping her. No one accepted it. A resident stood up and asked a simple question. Why didn't she just follow the law? She had no answer. Another resident asked if she understood how close the situation came to real harm. Silence. The officials then spoke. They explained the seriousness of impersonation and unlawful detention attempts. They explained that HOAs had limits, and crossing them had consequences. Real consequences. The former president's face drained of color. By the end of the meeting, the decision was clear. She was permanently removed from her position. Legal proceedings would continue outside the HOA. The room didn't cheer. It didn't clap. People just sat quietly, absorbing the weight of what they had witnessed. Outside, groups formed. Conversations were hushed but intense. Trust had been broken deeply, and rebuilding it would take time. He stood off to the side, watching. Several neighbors approached him. They thanked him. Some apologized. Others admitted they had been too afraid to speak before. He told them he understood. Fear had been the real weapon all along that night. News of the incident spread beyond the neighborhood. Not publicly, but through quiet channels. Other communities reached out, asking questions. They wanted to know how to protect themselves from similar abuse. The story had grown bigger than one street. The former HOA president retreated from public view. Her house stayed dark. Her presence disappeared. The authority she once relied on meant nothing now. He didn't feel victory. He felt closure beginning. A few days later, he received confirmation that formal charges related to the fake enforcement were moving forward. The process would take time, but accountability was no longer avoidable. Walking through the neighborhood felt different again. This time, it felt lighter. Conversations felt honest. People smiled without fear. Rules were still there, but now they were questioned, reviewed, and understood. Authority no longer felt absolute. One evening, he sat outside watching the sun go down. The same street that once felt hostile now felt human again. Imperfect, but alive. He thought about how close things came to going very wrong. How easily power could be misused when no one challenged it. And how calm resistance, facts, and patience had changed everything. The shock everyone expected had arrived not in the form of anger, but in the form of truth. And with the final stage approaching, one thing was certain. This story wasn't ending quietly. The last part would decide how the community moved forward and what justice truly looked like. The final phase didn't arrive with noise or drama. It came quietly, the way real consequences usually do. Paperwork moved. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Decisions were made carefully, not emotionally. The chaos from before had burned itself out, leaving behind something calmer but heavier. He went back to his routine. He woke up early. He took walks through the neighborhood without feeling watched. For the first time since moving in, his shoulders felt lighter. Not because everything was resolved, because the truth no longer needed defending. One morning, an official envelope arrived in the mail. He didn't rush to open it. He already knew what it would say. Still, his hands paused for a moment before tearing it open. Inside was confirmation that the case had reached its final stage. The actions taken against him had been ruled unlawful. The people involved would face consequences under the law. The matter was officially closed on his side. He sat down and let out a slow breath. Not relief, not joy, just calm. Later that day, he walked through the neighborhood again. This time, people greeted him openly. Some stopped to talk. Others simply nodded with respect. The unspoken tension that once filled the air was gone. A few days later, a community gathering was announced. Not an HOA meeting. Not an investigation. Just a gathering. People brought chairs. Someone brought drinks. Children played nearby. It felt human again. The interim board spoke briefly. They explained new safeguards, clear limits, transparency rules. No single person would ever hold unchecked power again. Decisions would require oversight. Records would be open to residents. People listened carefully, not because they were afraid anymore, but because they cared. He stood near the back, quietly observing. Someone asked him to say a few words. He shook his head at first, but the request came again. Gently this time, so he stepped forward. He didn't talk about what happened to him in detail. He talked about responsibility, about how easy it is for power to grow dangerous when people stop questioning it, about how silence protects the wrong things. His voice stayed calm. He reminded everyone that the goal wasn't revenge. It was balance. It was making sure no one else would ever feel trapped in their own home again. When he finished, there was no applause, just quiet agreement. Over the next week's changes became visible. Rules were simplified. Fines were reduced. Complaints required proof. Conversations replaced threats. The HOA no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a tool again. The former president was never seen in the neighborhood after that. Her house remained empty. Her name stopped being mentioned. People didn't gossip about her. They didn't need to. The lesson was already learned. One evening, a neighbor knocked on his door. The same neighbor who once warned him quietly to be careful. This time, the neighbors stood openly, no fear in their voice. They thanked him, not for standing up loudly, but for standing up calmly. That stayed with him. Months passed. Life moved forward. Seasons changed. The street looked the same, but it felt different. Kinder. More aware. Sometimes. He thought about how close everything had come to going wrong. How easily fear could have won. How one person's desire for control almost shattered an entire community, but it didn't. Because truth mattered. Because truth mattered. Because someone chose not to back down. Not with anger, but with patience and clarity. On a quiet evening, he sat on his porch watching the sun dip behind the houses. The same porch where strangers once stood pretending to have authority. The same spot where fear once crept in. Now it was just a porch again, a place to rest. He understood something clearly now. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't need an audience. Real power stays steady when tested, and when misused power finally meets truth, it always collapses under its own weight. The neighborhood moved on, and so did he. Not as a victim, not as a hero, just as someone who stood his ground and reminded everyone that no authority is above. Accountability. Time passed in a way that felt normal again. Days were no longer measured by letters, meetings, or tension. They were measured by sunlight through windows, morning routines, and quiet evenings. For the first time since moving in, he felt like he truly lived there instead of defending its right to exist. The neighborhood slowly found its rhythm again. People stopped whispering. Kids played freely, without parents watching nervously. Cars came and went without anyone questioning why someone had visitors or stayed out late. Small things, but meaningful ones. He noticed how different people behaved now. Conversations were honest. Disagreements happened, but they didn't feel threatening. When issues came up, they were discussed openly instead of hidden behind official language or quiet warnings. The community had changed, not perfectly, but permanently. One afternoon, a letter arrived that wasn't official. It was handwritten, short, simple. It thanked him for standing firm when others couldn't. It didn't praise him as brave or heroic. It simply said that because of what happened, people felt safer speaking up. He folded the letter carefully and put it away. That meant more to him than any formal apology. Over the next few months, other neighborhoods reached out. Not publicly, not dramatically. Quiet messages, emails, questions. People wanted to understand how such power abuse had happened and how it could be prevented. He didn't seek attention, but he didn't ignore them either. He shared what he learned. He told them to document everything, to ask questions calmly, to never assume authority meant legality, and most importantly, to talk to each other before fear isolated them. He realized something during those conversations. What happened to him wasn't rare. It was just rarely challenged. One evening, he was invited to sit in on a community discussion as an observer. No position, no title, just presence. The new board members wanted someone who had seen the consequences of unchecked authority to listen and give feedback. he agreed. The discussion wasn't perfect. People disagreed. Voices rose at times, but no one shut anyone down. No one threatened consequences for asking uncomfortable questions. That alone felt like progress. As weeks turned into months, the former HOA president became a distant memory. Not erased, but understood. People stopped using her name as a warning and started using the situation as a lesson that mattered. He sometimes thought about how close everything came to a different ending. If he had reacted with anger, if he had stepped outside without asking questions, if fear had guided his choices instead of clarity, the outcome could have been very different. That thought stayed with him. One quiet night, while sitting on his porch, a neighbor joined him. Not to talk about the past, but about the future. About how communities should protect people, not control them. About how rules should serve fairness, not ego. They talked until the streetlights came on. He realized then that something deeper had happened. The community didn't just remove a problem. It grew from the experience. That growth didn't come from punishment. It came from awareness. Life continued. Seasons changed. The house felt like home now. The walls held peace instead of tension. He no longer checked the door every time someone knocked. When mail arrived, it was just mail. No threats. No warnings. Just life. Looking back, he didn't define the experience as trauma or victory. He saw it as a reminder that systems only work when people question them. That authority without accountability always drifts toward abuse. And that calm resistance is often stronger than loud confrontation. The story didn't end with headlines or public statements. It ended with normalcy. And sometimes, that's the most powerful ending of all. Because the real shock wasn't what happened to him. The real shock was how easily power fell apart once. Truth stood quietly in its way. The year moved forward without announcements or reminders of what once happened. Yet the effects were everywhere. They showed up in small choices, in how people spoke to each other, and in how silence no longer felt like safety. The neighborhood didn't become perfect, but it became honest. He noticed it most in the mornings. People waved again. Not out of habit, but intention. Conversations happened in driveways, without someone checking over their shoulder. When disagreements came up, they stayed disagreements. They didn't turn into threats or warnings. That change mattered. He returned fully to his own life. Work demanded focus. Days filled up again. Evenings were quiet. He cooked simple meals, read, and took long walks without replaying old moments in his head. The fear that once sat quietly in his chest had faded into memory. Sometimes, a new resident would move in. They asked the usual questions. About trash days, parking rules, noise hours, and someone always explained something else too. They explained that rules existed, but people mattered more. He never announced his role in that shift. He didn't need to. The story lived on its own, passed quietly from one conversation to another. It's changing shape but keeping its meaning. One afternoon, a small issue came up. A minor dispute between neighbors about parking. In the past, this would have turned into formal notices and tension. This time, they talked. They disagreed, but they listened. They found a solution without escalation. Watching that happen felt more meaningful than any formal decision ever had. Months later, he was invited to sit in on a workshop organized by residents from nearby communities. Not as a speaker, just as someone who had seen what happens when authority forgets its limits. The room was small. The questions were thoughtful. No one wanted drama. They wanted prevention. He told them something simple. He said most problems grow because people feel alone. And when fear isolates people, power grows unchecked. But when people talk early, calmly, and together, even the strongest authority weakens. That idea stayed with him. He realized that the situation had changed him too. Not by making him cautious, but by making him more aware. He listened more. He questioned systems gently, but firmly. He trusted his instincts without letting them turn into suspicion. That balance felt important. One evening, While walking through the neighborhood, he passed the old community building. The lights were on. Laughter came from inside. It wasn't a meeting. It was a gathering. People sharing food, talking about everyday things. The space no longer felt like a place of control. It felt like a place of people. He stood outside for a moment, listening, then continued walking. He didn't need to go in. Just knowing that the space had changed was enough. Later that night, he thought about how stories usually end. Loud justice. Public apologies. Clear winners and losers. This one didn't end that way. It ended with understanding, and maybe that was why it lasted. He thought about the person who once stood across the street, confident in power that didn't belong to them. About how certainty without accountability always collapses. Not suddenly, but completely. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt clarity. Life continued forward. New challenges came, unrelated and ordinary. Bills, work deadlines. Small worries. Normal life. And that normalcy felt earned. On a quiet weekend morning, he sat on his porch again. The same place where fear once sat beside him. Now it was just sunlight, distant voices, and the sound of leaves. Moving, he understood something deeply then. Standing. Up doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like staying calm when others expect fear. Sometimes it looks like asking questions when others expect obedience. Sometimes it looks like patience, the story that began with control, ended with community. And the real shock wasn't how power was abused. The real shock was how easily it lost its grip. Once people stopped believing it was untouchable, the street moved. On, so did he. Not carrying a victory, not carrying resentment, just carrying the quiet knowledge that truth doesn't need permission to exist in when it finally stands. Everything else adjusts around it.